Actually, this is just a particular illustration of a general point made by John Hospers, one that was discussed in chapter 3. The connection between what caused someone to create an artwork and the character of the artwork they created is a wholly contingent one. We can never legitimately read back from the music to the composer's psychological history. To do so is to compound the all-important distinction between expressing and being expressive of. Expression is the communication of a mental state. Expressiveness is an imaginative way of articulating something. What is important about expressiveness in art is that it enhances our awareness. In a sense, it is misleading to use the term express at all, since it is not things experienced, but things imagined with which expressiveness is concerned. So in emphasizing expressiveness in art, we are really leaving behind any direct concern with emotion and asking whether we can use art to say things. Putting it like this, however, seems to raise a greater difficulty for music than for the other arts. Can absolute music say anything? Music as language. If music can say things, then it must, in some sense or other, be a kind of language. The title of Derek Cook's book, The Language of Music, makes this claim quite explicit. The passage quoted earlier continues as follows. If man is ever to fulfill the mission he undertook at the very start, when he first began to philosophize as a Greek and evolved the slogan, "Know thyself," he will have to understand his unconscious self, and the most articulate language of the unconscious is music. But we musicians, instead of trying to understand this language, preach the virtues of refusing to consider it a language at all, when we should be attempting, as literary critics do, to expound and interpret the great masterpieces of our art for the benefit of humanity at large. We concern ourselves more and more with parochial matters, technical analysis, and musicological minutiae, and pride ourselves on our detached, dehumanized approach. Neither the justice of Cook's complaint about fellow musicians nor his view of the language of the unconscious need concern us here. The relevant feature of this quotation is his attempt to establish the importance of music by comparing it with philosophical reflection and literary criticism, both of which are intellectual endeavors to which meaning and meaningfulness are central. Cook is not alone in making this comparison. Throughout the monumental 3-volume work, Man and His Music, the English musicologist Wilfrid Mellers repeatedly tries to establish the relative importance of composers and their work by appealing to what they have to say, the magnificence of their statements and visions. For example, all Haydn's later music, he tells us, reflects the beliefs that had meaning for him, an ethical humanism based upon reason and the love of created nature. With equal assurance, he asserts that Mozart transformed the symphony from Rococo entertainment into a personal testament. In a similar vein, the theologian Karl Barth is recorded as saying that Mozart could cause his listeners to hear the whole context of Providence. Other musicologists are less confident and think that Mellers' appeal to this sort of interpretation is excessive. Nevertheless, he is expressing more clearly than most something that has been a constant theme in the writings of musicians and their interpreters. Asked about the significance of his cello concerto, Elgar described it as a man's attitude to life, and Beethoven himself evidently held a view of this sort when he declared that music is a greater revelation than the whole of philosophy. Nor is it hard to see just why the thoughts of composers and musicians have moved so easily in this direction. Johann Christian Bach is said to have remarked of his brother, C.P.E. Bach, "My brother lives to compose, I compose to live." The remark was intended merely to reflect a difference of attitude towards the relative value of music on the part of each of them, no doubt. But others have been quick to see in it an explanation of the relative merits of the music that each composed. Carl Phillips is of serious interest. Johann Christian's merely light and amusing. To live for the sake of composition, if it is to make sense as a human ideal, requires that what is composed be properly described in terms such as affirmation, and by adjectives such as profound. Even exponents of minimalist music, who might be supposed least likely to think in terms of cognitive content, can be found employing the idea in order to justify evaluative judgments. In a program note on Litania, a piece by the minimalist composer Somei Sato, the pianist Margaret Lee Ting finds in it a dance of the dark soul. These examples illustrate that the importance of one type of piece of music over another seems most easily explained by reference to what each has to say to us. This is why composers and performers are often led to think of music in this way. The language of musical criticism seems to confirm the appropriateness of doing so, because critics and interpreters often refer to musical statements and restatements and to what a particular passage signifies or conveys. They also pass judgments that are difficult to understand unless music can be thought of in this way. For instance, Beethoven's music has sometimes been said to be witty rather than funny. Liszt's piano music described as structurally clever, but thematically banal. And Bruckner has been accused of being long-winded and inconsequential. All these examples show that there is a recurrent tendency for musicians and critics to explain the importance of music in terms of what it communicates. And this implies that music has communicative power. Once again, we ought to remember that common and familiar ways of speaking do not settle philosophical questions. The fact that the critics and even composers use the language of communication in their descriptions of music does not show that music communicates any more than the use of emotional terms showed that it has emotional content. There is the same possibility here that these terms used in connection with music are a case of analogical extension. Is it certainly plausible to think this in the case of the expression musical statement? Because often this means nothing more than a relatively plain rendering of the central motif or melody around which the subsequent variations and developments in a musical work are built. Still, both composers and interpreters have wanted more than this and applied the language of communication to music with the intention of retaining the cognitive import such language has in other contexts. In other words, they have wanted to say that music is a language. Yet, as even Mellers says, music as language raises a fundamental question. If music conveys experience as a language does, what kind of language is it? The language of poetry is basically the same as the normal means of communication between human beings. The poet may use words with a precision, a cogency, and a range of emotional reference which we do not normally find in a conversation. Yet, though the order he achieves from his counters may be more significant than the desultory patterns achieved by Tom, Dick, and Harry, at least the counters are the same in both cases. Even with the visual arts, there is usually some relationship between the order of forms and colors which the artist achieves and the shapes and colors of the external world. The relation between the formal and the representational elements is extremely complex and not easily susceptible to analysis. But it is at least usually clear that some such relationship exists. With music, the relationship between the forms of art and the phenomena of the external world is much less readily apprehensible. Music and representation. Sometimes the answer to the problem of music's meaning is thought to lie with the ability of music to represent. Up to this point, we have used the expression absolute music to mean music alone, without words. But musicologists sometimes draw a constant between absolute music and program music. The latter a term coined by the composer Franz Liszt, 1811 to 1886, to describe music that conjures up literary or visual images. The idea is that program music can say things because it can be used to represent to us aspects it can be used to represent to us aspects of nature and human experience. And surely it might be said, there can be no doubt that music can represent birdsong, battles, storms, armies, royal processions, pastoral countryside, as well as a range of emotions, grief, jollity, excitement, and so on. Certainly, music sometimes seems to represent. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony is a much quoted example in which we can identify points in the music with specific scenes and events. This is the sound of peasants from across the valley. This is the storm gathering, and so on. Such apparently clear examples, however, should not distract us from the need to be precise about what such representation amounts to and how far it really does explain the character and value of music. The first point to be made is this. Some of the things that pass for representation in music are more accurately described as imitation or replication. Replication of the sound of a bell is not a representation of the sound of a bell. It is the sound of a bell. If it is to represent something, it has to be something non-aural, a summons or the arrival of a visitor. For example, The distinction is an important one, because more sophisticated imitations found in music are often improperly described as representations. Birdsong is an obvious case. A composer may use instruments to imitate the song of a bird and successfully get us to think of birds at that point in the music. But it does not follow that he has represented the bird. Still, less said anything about it. Indeed, this need not be his purpose. The French composer Olivier Messiaen wrote a great deal of music which consisted, he said, in the transcription of sounds made by birds. He did this not for the purpose of representing birds, but because he regarded birdsong as a very pure form of music. Consequently, though Messiaen may rightly be described as imitating or replicating birdsong, he is simply making music. He is not representing anything. What then is representation proper? We might define it as the use of music, not to replicate the sound of something, but to prompt the idea of that thing in the mind of anyone listening to the music. The example of the bell illustrates the difference. The sound of a triangle might imitate or replicate a bell, but thereby represent the arrival of a visitor. In a similar way, a trumpet fanfare can represent a royal procession. It is also possible to represent emotional states in music. Grief by a slow rhythm in a minor key, fury suggested by violins rushing up a scale, or melancholy by a solo cello. The music is not itself furious or melancholic, neither is the composer. These are the non-musical things the music represents. It seems incontestable that composers do use such devices to convey ideas to the minds of their listeners. Many composers have expressly said they do, and their success in doing so is confirmed by the reactions of listeners. No serious listener, for instance, can fail to identify the gathering storm in Rossini's William Tell Overture. But we cannot immediately conclude from this that music has the power to communicate, because there is a crucial difference between prompting ideas in the minds of others and communicating thoughts to them in the way that language does. When I write or speak a natural language such as English or French, I have in my possession a means by which I can do far more than simply cause ideas to come into your mind. I can direct and manipulate those ideas. If you understand the words I utter, you will be compelled to have the thought that I express with them. This is not the same as saying that you are compelled to accept that thought as true or approve of it in some way. For instance, if I say, "This is a cup of tea," while pointing to a flower pot, your mind will entertain the thought, "This is a cup of tea," but will not believe it as true. A natural language is thus a powerful instrument of communication because it allows us to constrain the thoughts of others. It allows us to make them think things, though not to make them believe those things, and to do so in a certain way. Constraining the thoughts of others contrasts with merely prompting thoughts in others. We can prompt ideas in wholly accidental ways. For example, it might be that a chance gesture of mine reminds you of your childhood or a play you once attended. I did not communicate these ideas to you. I merely caused you accidentally to have them. Nor does intentionality turn this sort of causality into communication. I might know that the gesture in question would cause you to be reminded of an episode in childhood, and I might intentionally make the gesture. But this is no different from causing you pain. If I stick a pin in you, I have caused you pain, and might even cause you to think about pain, but I have not told you anything. It would be very odd to describe my action as a form of communication just because you had a thought as a result. In a similar way, merely prompting a thought is not communicating that thought. Now, it is not difficult to imagine this kind of simple prompting being expanded into a system of signs. A group of children, for instance, might invent a vocabulary of gestures which they use to convey information and warnings to each other. Such a system need not be deliberately or consciously learned. Other children might learn it simply in the course of play and thereby become both receptive to messages received in this form and adept at sending them. In such a case, we can say there is a form of communication that rests upon widely shared contentions. A similar story might be told for music. Over the years, a set of musical conventions has grown up by means of which it is possible for composers to prompt a range of ideas in the minds of listeners. A range that includes both ideas and objects and of feelings. Music has thus become a form of communication in its own right, in the same way that a sign language has such as semaphore is a form of communication. The fact that the music of different parts of the world does not readily transcend the cultures in which it developed bears out the suggestion that the prime basis of musical communication is conventional. People, somewhat romantically, are inclined to refer to music as a universal language. But it is obvious that initially, at any rate, Chinese, Indian, or Arabic music is difficult for those brought up on Western music to understand and appreciate, and vice versa. This is not hard to explain. Take, for example, a peal of bells used to convey the idea of a wedding, or a tolling bell to convey the idea of death. In both cases, the sound of the bell gets its meaning from certain social practices at weddings and funerals. These practices are distinctively Western. Mosques do not have peals of bells, and accordingly a peal of bells does not have the same associations in Islamic countries, with the result that the sound of the bell cannot convey those ideas to Islamic ears. It would be a mistake to think that the music's ability to convey ideas is entirely conventional. Some of the conventions built on natural associations between sounds and rhythms. It is no accident that the ringing of bells at weddings takes the form of a peal, loud and jangling, whereas that for funerals takes the form of a toll, slow and solitary, and each seems naturally fitting to the occasion. And there are non-conventional associations that rely on isomorphic relationships. A rapidly rising sequence of notes is naturally associated with upward physical movement, and it seems to have an equally natural association with excitement. Thus, almost every setting of the Christian Mass makes the music of the line a resurrexit tertium D, and on the third day he rose again, move vigorously upwards. And there appear to be other natural associations that composers can exploit. Talk of musical jokes is often rather strained, but there is no doubt that some musical sequences do make people laugh, just as there are musical sequences which make them pensive. There are a number of devices, some conventional, some natural, that composers can use to convey ideas in their music. Together they add up to a reasonably complex and sophisticated set of devices for the stimulation and or provocation of feelings and ideas. But is this enough to allow us to declare music to be a language? Do these devices give music the power, and hence the value, that Cook, Mellers, and others attribute to it? Musical vocabulary and musical grammar. We now need to return to the distinction between a means of signaling or prompting ideas and a form of communication in the fullest sense. Consider again the case in which some chance gesture of mine awakens in you a memory of childhood. I have caused you to think of your childhood, but on its own that does not amount to my having conveyed the idea to you. Nor would the difference be made up if my gesture was one of a complex sequence that causes a corresponding sequence of images or thoughts. Why not? The answer is that merely causality of this kind does not rely upon your understanding anything. It simply exploits certain contingent connections between my gestures and your early childhood experience. I have no more communicated an idea to you than has a dog whose barking reminds you to lock the door at night, or the alarm clock that tells you it's time to get up. In both cases, you have merely been caused to have the idea. Something of the same sort might now be said about the representational use of music. I might use the sound of a triangle to prompt in you the thought, a visitor. But if I succeed, this is not because you have in any proper sense understood the sound as you might a word, but that you have come to associate the sound of a bell with the arrival of visitors. What is missing is the idea that my music has constrained your thoughts. In a famous experiment, the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, conditioned dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. It may be correct to say that the sound of the bell prompted the idea meat in them, but it would be entirely fanciful to suppose that they understood the bell to be saying dinner time. This idea of constraining thought has a parallel in painting. A painter might arrange abstract colors and shapes on his canvas in a way that, as it happens, causes you to think of a tree that once grew in front of the house in which you lived. Or a painter might paint the house and tree with which you were familiar, but paint them so that you are obliged to see them the wrong way round. The tree behind the house. This illustrates the ability of painting to use perspective not merely to prompt, but to constrain perception. And it is what makes painting a form of communication. The question is there a parallel to perspective in music? We have already noted that music has considerable representational resources in a wide range of natural and conventional associations. However, once we introduce the distinction between a means of communicating thoughts to others, best exemplified in a natural language, and a means of prompting ideas in others, which we will call a representational system, it becomes apparent that there can be representational systems of considerable complexity, which nevertheless fall far short of being a natural language. Their deficiency might be expressed thus: they have a vocabulary, but no grammar. They can point to single ideas or sets of ideas, but they cannot say anything about them. Music can be interpreted as having a vocabulary. It is easy to find examples in which a musical phrase can plausibly be said to indicate or represent some object, emotion, or event. In this sense, objects and ideas can be represented in music. It is hard, though, to identify any way in which music directs or guides our thoughts about what is represented. Consider once more the simple case of the bell. The sound of a triangle imitates a bell and thereby represents the arrival of a visitor. But what are we to think? Thus far described, oh good, here is a visitor, is as apt an interpretation of the music as, oh no, a visitor. Precisely the same point can be made about far more sophisticated cases. In the language of music, Derek Cook interprets the descending minor 5-3-1 progression as the expression of a falling away from the joy of life. This is a more controversial example of representation in music than the bell, of course. But even if we accept that music can represent such high-level states of mind and feeling, the same point about ambiguity arises. The progression could mean it is time to fall away from the joy of life, or it could mean never allow yourself to fall away from the joy of life. Since these are contradictory injunctions, the music cannot be considered as effective means of communication at all. It prompts ideas and thoughts, but since it cannot constrain them in any particular direction, it cannot use them to say anything. Ambiguities and uncertainties in music can be resolved when the music has some linguistic accompaniment, most obviously words, libretto. But even a dedication or a title, one of the best known pieces of program music, is Mussorgsky's composition, Pictures at an Exhibition. Originally 10 piano pieces, now generally performed in an orchestral arrangement by Ravel, Mussorgsky was inspired to write it by an exhibition of paintings in St. Petersburg. Knowing this, and knowing something of the pictures that the music is supposed to represent, we can see why Mussorgsky composed what he did. But someone who did not know the title of the work or the individual movements could not identify the objects in the various pictures just by listening to the music. Linguistic identification is essential. Similarly, in Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, or Saint Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, although the instruments and tunes that represent the different animals are appropriate in a general way, the cello for the gliding swan, the double bass for the elephant, and so on, different instruments could equally well serve for a number of different animals. We only know precisely what animals are represented because we are told in words. The music itself is not enough. This is not to say that the words do all the work. A musical setting can embellish, illustrate, and illuminate words, and on occasion transform them almost from banality to the sublime. Benjamin Britten's St. Nicholas might be an example. It can conversely reduce them to farce. To my ears, this is the effect of the section "Fling Wide the Gates" in Stainer's Crucifixion. A composer can take a familiar text and by setting it to music, revitalize it or give it a definitive interpretation. Handel's Messiah is a very clear example of this. In all these ways, music has powerful effects of its own to add. Nevertheless, the relationship between words and music is asymmetrical. Okay, I had to take my case off of there. That's what I forgot to do. So, the phone gets hot and the rubber case turns loose. Okay, all right. So, nevertheless, the relationship between words and music is asymmetrical. Words resolve ambiguities in the meaning of the music. But should the words themselves be ambiguous, the music cannot resolve the matter. In short, the music always follows and never leads the words. It lacks the ability to impart a meaning of its own. This deficiency and its importance are both illustrated in a well-known example. Against the theme of the final of his last string quartet, Beethoven wrote "Muss en sein," et muss sein. Must it be? It must. Most commentators have taken these words as indicative of the meaning of the music, and have thus understood the music to be expressing a hard-won mystical or religious acceptance of the human condition that Beethoven achieved only towards the end of his life. However, a possibly apocryphal story goes that Beethoven claimed the words recorded an exchange between him and his housekeeper, who was asking for more money. Let us suppose the story is true. Perhaps this interpretation was a joke on his part, and the words really express resignation. Or perhaps it was not a joke, and he wrote these down as a reminder that the music he himself regarded as the finest he had ever written arose from the mundane need for money. An interpretation that does nothing to diminish the value of the music. All of these are plausible, and the philosophical point the example makes is this: neither listening nor analyzing the music will settle the matter in favor of one interpretation, because the music itself is consonant with all of them. If the music really did communicate the metaphysical or religious ideas that some have found in it, there should be no doubt that Beethoven was joking or the story is apocryphal. Since there is a doubt here, it follows that the music by itself cannot direct our thoughts in one way rather than the other. This particular example is especially telling. Beethoven's late quartets are often cited as examples of the most serious and profound music ever written. If true, this is music we have reason to value more than any other. It is common to hear this profundity explained in terms of the ideas about human life and experience that the quartets express. Yet, as we have seen, the music itself cannot confirm this explanation, even if we agree that these quartets prompt us to have certain moods and ideas. They cannot tell us what to think about them. If the same thing were true of a work of philosophy or science, we would declare it a failure. Philosophers and scientists could merely state or assert ideas, and thus prompt us to have those ideas in our heads. But this would not add to our understanding of human experience. The point of a philosophical or scientific argument is to bring us to a conclusion. Just as the painting imagined earlier places the tree in front of the house. In short, even if we make large concessions to those who believe that music can be said to have content other than harmonious sound, and allow that music may be used systematically for the suggestion of ideas and feelings, we still cannot conclude that music constitutes a true form of communication. Communicative power, therefore, cannot be the explanation of its importance and value. Resume. The argument so far has shown that if we value music solely because of the pleasure it gives us, we cannot explain why we should value greater complexity and sophistication of structure. At the same time, to attribute the difference in value solely to complexity seems to leave out what most people think important about music, its emotional content. But the relation between music and emotion is not easy to isolate, partly because of quite general reasons, and partly because of factors having to do with music in particular. It seems that a familiar and attractive account of music and its value has to be abandoned. We cannot make sense of the idea that music itself contains emotion, and we have no grounds for thinking that music described in emotional terms must have had its origins in the emotional life of the composer. The application of emotional terms to music is unobjectionable, but they take their meaning by analogical extension from the context of real emotion, which was their original home. An alternative attempt to explain the difference between serious and light in music is to be found in the suggestion that music is a form of communication by means of which beliefs and ideas about human experience can be conveyed. Careful examination shows, however, that while music can indeed represent things, it can do so only to a very limited extent. Furthermore, the form of this representation falls far short of communication in the fullest sense. Beethoven was right if he thought that his music should be held in the highest regard, but not because, as he claimed, it was a greater source of revelation than philosophy. Music has elements that can be thought of as a vocabulary, but it has nothing equivalent to a grammar. The result is that it can operate something like a system of signs that stand for things in the way that non-linguistic road signs do. A road sign tells us that we are approaching a junction, but it cannot tell us whether to turn right or left. In a similar fashion, a fanfare of trumpets says royalty, but without words to guide us, it does not tell us whether to hope or fear, admire or despise. We can call music a language if we will, but it is a language that does not allow us to say anything of any sophistication. Where then does the value of music lie? The uniqueness of music. Many musicians find the conclusion that music is not a language deeply disappointing, since they think this devalues it with regard to the other arts, as well as science and philosophy. Yet the more we think about music, the easier it becomes to see that its value has to lie in its uniqueness. There is an old joke among opera goers that Wagner's music is better than it sounds, while Puccini's music sounds better than it is. There may be a point the joke is making, but its humor arises from the absurdity of the idea that music can be judged independently of how it sounds. Because music just is sound. Consequently, attempting to explain the merits of Wagner or demerits of Puccini in terms other than how their music sounds is attempting the impossible. The general lesson is that we should be on guard against any explanation of the nature and value of music that makes hearing the music itself redundant. Curiously, though the ideas about emotion and representation that we have been considering find great favor amongst both musicians and musicologists, this is precisely what both of them do: render music redundant. For example, Mellers, one of the most enthusiastic proponents of the idea that music is a language, suggests that Beethoven's late quartets say in music what the poet T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets say. But if this really were true, Beethoven's music would in a sense be redundant. We could read Eliot's poems instead. It seems right, then, to insist on the irreplaceability of music. No other medium can do what it does. All attempts to explicate the character or meaning of music in non-musical terms, emotions and ideas, are the two we have considered at length, are doomed from the outset. This is because what we are seeking to explain, music, is unique. Music differs from other art forms in this respect. It is neither unintelligible nor silly to think that photography could replace painting. This is why painting has been challenged to assert its distinctiveness since the invention of photography. Similarly, the value of theater is threatened somewhat by the advent of film and television. Even literature can be threatened in this way by the adaptation of novels for the screen. Painting, literature, and the theater may indeed have values that these other media cannot replicate, but it seems obvious that they offer the same sort of thing as photography and film, namely the visual and the narrative. But what could possibly take the place of music? In a later section, we will consider the recent emergence of other sonic arts, but insofar as such things are possible, they are non-musical. Music truly is unique. It is a mistake, however, to suppose that the uniqueness of music means its value cannot be spelled out in any way whatever. What is needed is a way of saying something about the value of music that does not attempt to explicate it in non-musical terms, but does allow us to consider critically the claims that can be made on its behalf.